When you walk into the office, the factory, or wherever you work, you expect certain things. How people speak to you, how your boss behaves, how you're made to feel. And some of the country's biggest employers have faced hard questions recently about allegations of bad behaviour on their watch. Claims of sexual harassment from female staff at the CBI, one of Britain's biggest business groups. The Tesco chairman, John Allen, standing down over sexual misconduct allegations, although he says he is determined to prove his innocence. Then there was Dominic Raab, no longer Deputy Prime Minister, after a report found he was, quote, persistently aggressive in meetings. And after Phillip Schofield quit ITV's This Morning over his, quote, unwise but not illegal relationship with a younger male colleague, he has had to deny bullying claims too. And so has his programme editor, Martin Frizzell.
Is there a toxic work environment at This Morning?
I'll tell you what's toxic.
I've always found toxic.
Is aubergine. Do you like aubergine?
That's him, avoiding questions from Sky News about allegations of toxic behaviour on set.
Do you?
Is there a toxic work environment?
But do you like
at This
aubergine?
Morning?
Because I don't like aubergine. It's just a personal thing.
He's being outrageously dismissive and flippant on camera about an immensely serious issue.
Never before has how we're treated at work been talked about so much. I'm Kimberley Leonard, and this is the Sky News Daily. In a minute, I'll be asking a legal training expert why we're hearing more about toxic workplace culture at the moment. But first, Frances Frei.
I'm an operations management professor, which means I'm good at getting to the root cause of problems. And my mindset is everything is fixable.
Frances was a professor at Harvard Business School when she got a call from Uber in 2017. The company was in the middle of a very public crisis, and they needed her help to fix it.
And so when I got there and there was, the riders were upset, the drivers were upset, the employees were upset, the shareholders, the regulators, everyone was upset. I knew that there had to be a root cause to that problem. And by what I read, I had a hypothesis that trust was probably being broken at lots of levels.
Uber's toxic workplace culture was first exposed in a blog post that was published by a former employee. It detailed allegations of sexism and harassment, and it went viral. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. A US federal investigation was launched, and the company was eventually forced to pay out almost £3.5 million to employees who were sexually harassed at work. Now, Frances, that first complaint really opened the floodgates, didn't it? How many people at Uber then came forward with their own complaints at the time?
Oh my gosh, so many complaints, like maybe 1,000 complaints, which is, first of all, I want to thank everyone who complained, because it's only when people complain that we can see it in the data that we have a chance of fixing it. So I remain grateful to everyone that complained.
In all those complaints, what kind of complaints were you dealing with?
When we looked at all of the complaints, and there were of many shapes and sizes, but there was one strong throughput, which is that almost all of them, like 95% of them, described an interaction between an employee and their manager, whether it was a frontline manager or the most senior manager in the organization. And so that told us where to look. And it was in the interactions of managers. And when we saw the complaints, we were like, goodness, a lot of these managers, they're either bad people or they haven't been taught how to manage.
So what were some of the things that you were trying to deal with?
Very simple things like how to give feedback. So at Uber, it had become a bit of a competitive sport to give feedback in a way that really felt brutal to people. So they hadn't used positive reinforcement very much. And I know as an academic that sincere and specific positive reinforcement is far more powerful than constructive advice, but nobody had ever taught them that. So they thought their job was to just keep giving piercing constructive advice. That was making people's satisfaction go down. People were scared. They stopped trying to, innovate because they didn't want to get in trouble. So I think it was those sorts of things. And then when any sensitive issues came up, like interpersonal, when we're dealing with real live people, it was handled enormously clumsy. Like just, you would not have wanted your children to be the ones that were bringing up sensitive topics, and it was in the hands of uneducated, clumsy people. It turned out they weren't bad people. They just had never been taught. And I quickly understood why they hadn't been taught. They would get hired as an individual contributor, do a good job, and very soon after be promoted to manager. And then very soon after be promoted to a manager of managers because the company was growing so fast. In retrospect, I'm sure the company would have layered on education as they grew, as opposed to having to come in and do it after the crisis.
We've heard just how bad the culture can become in workplaces, and we'll come back to what can be done about it in a minute. But let's talk more about how companies are dealing with this. Neha Lugg is a senior trainer at the law firm Lewis Silkin. Neha, we've had so many high-profile examples of bad behaviour at work recently. A lot of companies now looking inwards. Why do you think that issues like bullying, harassment, toxic workplaces have come under such scrutiny lately?
So I think there's lots of different reasons, and perhaps maybe the starting point is really having a think about acceptable workplace conduct, what that really looks like. And yet you're right, we haven't really seen it leave the headlines in what feels like years now. And I think the foundation for acceptable workplace conduct is really that our behaviour and those everyday kind of workplace interactions that make up our culture, whether they're in person or virtual, we need to be ensuring that they're safe, respectful, and create sort of an inclusive culture for all. We live in a very diverse society, and those different personal characteristics are they're interplaying at work. We have different beliefs, we have different religions, different cultures, different protected beliefs. And we've seen that a lot recently come under scrutiny when we look at gender identity and gender critical beliefs. But with that greater diversity comes greater challenge at work and how we demonstrate respect for other people's views and opinions. And we really know that how we see that changes over time. We have maybe 4 or 5 generations interacting together in the workplace. So colleagues need to understand how workplace values and attitudes have moved and shifted, and that can create friction. And again, that's why we're seeing so much of this. It's a topic of conversation at the moment.
It's interesting when you say there's different generations all together in the workplace. When you look at how things have changed over time, how do you think workplace standards have changed over time?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The standards of workplace behaviour are really evolving, at pace. And I would say especially so in more recent years. So I started my legal career around 15 years ago. And in that time, I've seen so much change. I'd say both in terms of employer responsibilities, but equally in terms of employee expectations. So what's driving that change? Well, I think for me, it's sort of 3 key drivers. So first, really prominent global movements. So we know that the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement have created this fundamental shift in creating sort of global change in that conversation around workplace standards and inequities that exist in our societies. And employers have been very much compelled to take a stance on those inequalities, inequities in the workplace. So secondly, I think around employee expectations. Employees now more than ever, they want to work for an organisation that reflects their values. So we're seeing an increasing number of employees sort of pursuing what we call value-driven, purpose-driven employment, where if their workplace, the behaviours that they see at work don't align with their values, employees are voting with their feet. So employers in this kind of really competitive market to attract and retain talent are having to respond. And I think the third key driver of change really is around COVID. That has played a huge role in shaping our working lives. I think there was an sort of increased understanding of individuals' personal lives. And before we perhaps had this kind of work is work, home is home, this sort of delineation. But I think all of a sudden with COVID, we started understanding what was going on for people and how those workplace interactions, those workplace pressures, and how we showed up for other people really mattered. So, COVID had people kind of reevaluating what matters to them, personal health, physical, mental well-being. And I think employers are really having to respond by creating environments that are inclusive, that demonstrates safe, respectful and inclusive behaviours. And I think that's been a real, driver for change.
Okay, so the idea of misconduct and harassment versus, a tough boss or it's just a high pressure workplace, it can be a bit blurry sometimes. So how do you know, and perhaps you can explain what is acceptable and what the legal definitions are, and is an HR issue different to a legal issue at work?
That's a great question. And I think with these evolving standards of workplace behaviour, workplace conduct, I think that's a really tough scope to define. And we know that some of those unacceptable behaviours, so as you say, discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment, victimisation, we know that those unacceptable behaviours are sort of set out in the law. But there are lots of different types of behaviours that we think and we see to be unacceptable at work that aren't necessarily in the law. And a good example, as you say, is bullying. So in the UK, there's no legal definition of bullying. So, what are those behaviours that we think of that could constitute bullying? Well, we saw that in Dominic Raab's sort of report recently, there was behaviour that was intimidating, persistently aggressive, undermining, humiliating. So we saw there were allegations around sort of abuse of power, and that issue around senior roles and interacting across different levels of seniority can create challenge. But where possible, I think that managers, line managers, people managers have such a strong role to play in creating the right culture, demonstrating the right behaviours, and making sure that what they do and how they demonstrate that to their teams is really setting an example. And data from the CIPD recently showed that when you have a toxic workplace culture and when you have poor behaviour at a senior level, that's often replicated by the junior staff. So a recognition that people managers and those at a senior level have a really strong role to play.
Yes, but interestingly, Dominic Raab's response to the report findings from his bullying allegations was to say the threshold for bullying was too low. And of course, we heard from the editor of ITV's This Morning earlier. His aubergine comments have been heavily criticised as flippant. Frances Frei, let's come back to you. Do you think it's management style that determines workplace culture, both at Uber and more generally? And if that is the case, then who is to blame? Is it individuals who set the tone for that management style, or is it systemic?
So it's systemic. I mean, there's always individuals that need to be separated because they're like a source of lots of troubles. But in every culture that I've gone into, it's systemic, and it's not systemic. It wasn't designed to be harmful, but we didn't understand the 360-degree view around it. So when people were growing and promoting, it was lauded as an awesome organization that promoted from within, and it just didn't have enough peripheral vision to understand the damage it was doing. I think today, everybody gets to look at the very public situation that Uber had, and it's far less likely that people are going to have managers be promoted without teaching them their job, which is how to manage.
So what about employees who are stuck in these toxic workplaces? If that internal system is broken, it's very difficult for them to even come forward with a complaint. You said thanks a lot to everyone who complained, but if they're in a system where it's so hard to complain, what should they do?
Yeah. So my advice would be to complain anonymously. Almost every organization today has an anonymous complaint line. And if you feel like it's too risky to, and encourage other people to complain. When we have it in the data, then when somebody looks at it, they get to see it. Like when we looked at the 1,000 complaints, it was immediately clear what needed to happen. So I would say, one, do it anonymously if you don't feel comfortable doing it in person, and do it in groups. So employees have a lot of power if they go together, as we say.
I suppose in some instances, places are so toxic and the management don't want to change that inevitably people end up leaving.
Oh, yeah. So listen, if management doesn't want to change, I would not encourage people to stay. The only obstacle we've ever seen to completely transforming a toxic culture is the desire to change. So if that desire isn't there, if there's not a willingness to do it, each person, if you have an option, I would invite you to go to a place where you don't have to endure that. But if management wants to change, in our experience, meaningful change happens very rapidly. In fact, meaningful change must happen rapidly. And so as soon as we set out on it, we were able to fix the culture very, very quickly. And I would argue if we had tried to take a long time, we wouldn't have been nearly as successful. Because if you take a long time, you're sending mixed messages to people. We see your problem, but it's really not important enough for us to put it at the top of our priority list. So when convenient, we'll put it at the top of our priority list, but we're going to go about business as usual. When we see people being harmed, our response needs to be urgent.
My thanks to Frances Frei and Neha Lugg. This episode of Sky News Daily was produced by Sydney Peat with Alex Eden and Rosie Gillett. The editor is Phillip Beaumont. I'm Kimberley Leonard. See you next time.
From Sky News Podcasts.
People treat it as a joke, a juicy bit of gossip.
After the scandal which ultimately brought down a Prime Minister.
Mr. Pincher, what exactly happened in the Carlton Club?
We take you inside the corridors of power.
I felt someone grab my arse and I turned around and this guy was just like looking right at me.
You know, basically, if it's not full-on rape, it's okay.
To hear the stories that people have been and still are afraid to tell.
You know, some of the most dangerous people are probably the last people that you'd ever suspect.
And why those accused often face no consequences.
They're relying on you, not fighting the machine in a way.
My biggest fear is if I don't speak out, he's going to be around forevermore.
The Open Secret, wherever you get your podcasts.